One of the things we've been talking about over at RBN, we are, pretty much done with the two-party system. A lot of us were supporters of Bernie Sanders. We canvassed for Bernie Sanders, donated money to his campaign, as well as members of the squad as well. We have found that we can help people more so by doing direct action and mutual aid. So that's kind of where we've been putting like most of our focus. When you think about like movements that have happened in this country, I always point to the civil rights movement because at that time it was unpopular, but it became very successful. And so the question I have for you, do you think we could have a movement like that in this country today, but this time a class movement where working class and poor people were fighting together here and marching the same way the activists did during the civil rights movement? Do you think that could happen, and why or why not?
Well, let's differentiate between the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement because they're different. So Martin Luther King attracted white liberals, largely from the North. Now, at the end of toward the end of King's life, he began to sound more and more like Malcolm. And in fact, David Halberstam did an interview with King, I think a few months before he died, and said he sounded like a nonviolent Malcolm X. I mean, Malcolm X was a nonviolent Malcolm X, but there was a convergence there, and understanding that if you didn't eradicate economic racism, you would never eradicate racism. Well, that's when the white liberals began to walk away from King. And figures like Fred Hampton, who this amazing Chicago Black Panther, who actually united poor whites and poor blacks. Of course, he was assassinated by the FBI and the Chicago police when he was 24. That they can't accept. I think the future is organizing, like with the Amazon warehouse, and not going in and asking people whether they voted for Trump, but by organizing against centers of power. That is an education of itself. We forget that all successful labor movements have a heavy educational component. And the ruling elite is going to work very hard to make sure that those racial divisions are exacerbated. That's why the ruling elite was supporting Trump over Sanders. If you remember, even the major Democratic donors like Lloyd Blankfein, the former CEO of Goldman Sachs, there's an organization full of people who should be in prison. He's said that if Sanders was the nominee, which the Democratic Party is never going to allow, he would vote for Trump. So this whole mantra of the least worst, it doesn't apply to them, the oligarchs. It only applies to us. You saw that there were two campaigns where the military-industrial complex and the corporate elite felt challenged. One was 1948 with Henry Wallace. They destroyed him. He had been Roosevelt's vice president. The other was the 1972 campaign with McGovern. And there you saw a very similar process where the ruling oligarchs, both within the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, united to destroy Wallace and then united to destroy McGovern. And now we see a similar phenomena where the ruling oligarchs from the Republican Party have fused themselves with the ruling oligarchs of the Democratic Party. I'm talking about the traditional Republican Party, the Bushes, Liz Cheney, to counter this kind of right-wing populism, proto-fascism that has risen up within and taken over the Republican Party. My friend Glenn Ford used to call it Trump's white man's party. But I think that, you had Robert Reich wrote a column a couple of weeks ago saying maybe Liz Cheney would be our best candidate for president. This is utter insanity. But I think it shows the moral bankruptcy of the liberal elite and the liberal class. So it's all about organizing, because there you can cross racial lines in an Amazon warehouse, for instance. So I teach these amazing students, and if they have a 3.1, they get out, they can matriculate to Rutgers and finish their degree. Well, a lot of my students have been organizing the service workers at Rutgers University. My students are black, almost all of them. And a lot of these workers voted for Trump, but that's irrelevant. And I think the left has kind of committed suicide by going down that rabbit hole of woke culture and cancel culture, which not only doesn't play out with the working class, it doesn't play out with any of my students in prison. They don't have time for that at all.
I'm interested too in reference to organizing, because I think one of the things that I struggle with we have more technology now. We have social media. We have internet. And when I think about activists back in the 60s and the 70s, they didn't have any of that. And they were able to get hundreds and thousands of people together. We try to organize a lot, like across like social media platforms. It's a struggle, especially with a platform like Twitter, just because there's always people that come in that they're infiltrators. They pretend like they're for the cause, and then they turn on you, or they get people to be against it. And I'll give you a perfect example. Last year, we had the marches for Medicare for All. They were in different cities across the country, and there were some nefarious actors. They pretended like they were for it, and then obviously turned on us as well. I was really surprised to see the number of people that they went along with Bernie Sanders' movement. And Bernie Sanders told us it's about the 99%, and we need Medicare for all. Some of those same people, when we were like, yes, we still need to fight for these issues, all of a sudden, because it wasn't attached to a campaign, they didn't like it. They thought it was a bad idea. They didn't want to protest. They didn't want to march. Or they say, like, what is a march actually going to do? What has been your experience in reference to that, like direct action? And when you get those kind of comments that come through, like, well, what is a march going to do?
Well, so social media like Twitter is very useful in creating flash mobs. You can get a large number of people, like the Women's March on Washington against Trump. But it's not a good and effective tool for organizing, which is about building personal connections. So I spent a lot of time in Zuccotti Park during Occupy. There you saw people building relationships and building connections quite potently. So social media is effective in terms of getting out a message quickly. It's effective in getting people to gather at a certain point for a one-off. But it's not effective at building movements. Movements are built the old-fashioned way. And they, as we saw, you look at what Chris Smalls did in Staten Island. I mean, how many years did it take him to build that union? I think it's 2 or 3 years. That's what it takes. It's almost person by person, and that's what we have to go back to doing. And if you're sitting alone in front of your screen, not only are you not really doing activism, but you're exactly where the ruling elites want you to be, which is alone in front of your screen.